Then people started shouting together, "Free Dante Drum!" The words were heard right across town. There were smoke bombs. Then someone threw a brick through the window of a police car. Suddenly, there were police officers everywhere, pointing guns at the crowd. Everyone held their breath. Then the police officers relaxed. They put away their guns, and the crowd started moving along the street, following the car and loud music of Trey Glover. "Where are you going, Trey?" asked the black police officer. "We're going to the courthouse," replied Trey. "Keep the march peaceful, and there won't be any trouble," said the officer. The crowd moved slowly forward. Some people were carrying signs that they had made. "Stop the killing," and "Free Dante Drum." People were angry, but they were having fun, too. It felt good to show the white people of Sloan their anger, and they were proud of the large numbers of protesters. At 11:27 a.m., there was a call to the emergency services. The Bethel African Church was burning. It was a church for black people, including Roberta Drum and her family. 2 white men had gone into the church, and minutes later, there had been smoke. Fire trucks now rushed to put out the fire. As news of the fire spread, Keith was finally driving into Sloan. Boyette had taken a pill and had slept peacefully on the back seat for a few hours. Now he was awake and looking calmly out the window. "I never thought I'd see this place again," he said. "Do you recognize it?" asked Keith. "Not really. It's like a lot of other towns. The only special thing about Sloan was Nicole." Robbie and his team had had a call from Keith to say that he was almost there. They already had a big pile of paperwork about Boyette. They'd found the lawyer who had worked with him in Sloan. They had a statement from the owner of the room where Boyette had stayed in the months before Nicole's disappearance. They had documents about the building that Boyette had helped to build. His story seemed to fit. "Don't all stare at him when he comes in," Robbie warned. He heard a car parking outside, and then, finally, the minister and his passenger were there. Some quick introductions were made. "I remember you," Boyette said suddenly to Robbie. "You were on TV after the boy was arrested. You were upset, shouting at the camera." "Yes, that was me." "Where were you?" "I was here, Mr. Flack, watching it all. I couldn't believe they'd arrested the wrong guy." "That's right, the wrong guy." Robbie wanted to hit Boyette and shout insults at him, but he forced himself to stay calm. Insults and violence weren't going to help Dante. Robbie led the visitors to his office. "Can I get you something to drink?" "I hate to ask this, Robbie," Keith said, "but we haven't eaten for a long time." Robbie phoned through to Fanta and ordered a plate of sandwiches. "Well, there's no time to waste, Mr. Boyette. What did you want to tell us?" Silence. Boyette stared at the ground, and his head made sudden jumping movements. Keith and Robbie waited. At last, Boyette said, "I need to know if there's any reward money." "You're not serious, are you?" Robbie asked.
I think everything's serious right now, Mr. Flack.
"Until now, I've heard nothing about reward money," said Keith angrily.
I was just wondering, that's all,
said Boyette. "That's all?" Robbie repeated. "The execution of an innocent man is less than 6 hours away, and we don't have much chance of stopping it. I'm sitting with the guilty man, and he wants money for what he's done."
Who says I'm the real killer?
"You!" shouted Keith. "Stop playing games, Travis. And you don't need any money. You'll be dead in a few months."
Thanks for reminding me, Pastor.
Robbie looked angrily at Boyette. In fact, Robbie would happily give Boyette his own house in exchange for a statement that would save Dante. Boyette started rubbing his head. The pain had started again. Keith recognized the signs. "He's having another seizure," he explained to Robbie. "Sometimes coffee helps." Robbie rushed out to get some.
I'm going to be sick. I need to lie down,
said Boyette. He lay painfully on the sofa, with his arms around his head and his knees pulled up to his chest.
Can you turn off the lights?
"We don't have time for this," said Robbie, ready to scream.
Please, I'll be okay in a minute,
said Boyette, as his whole body shook. Keith and Robbie turned off the lights and left the room. They came for Dante at noon. Not a minute before, not a minute after. He was talking to Cedric when there was a loud knock on the metal door. Everyone knew what the noise meant. Roberta quickly put her hand on the glass, and Dante did the same. His brothers and sister held their mother. "I love you, Mom," Dante said. "And I'm so sorry this is happening." "I love you too, baby. And you don't have to say sorry. You did nothing wrong. Your father knew that, and I know it too. I guess I'll be seeing Dad soon." Roberta had no time to answer. The door opened behind Dante, and a big guard came into the room. Dante put down the phone and was led out. Chapter 7. Thursday afternoon. "There's still a chance, Dante, but it's a small one. Don't feel bad, Robbie. I'll be okay." In 2000, when Dante and the other prisoners at Huntsville Prison were moved to Polunsky, the execution room had stayed at Huntsville. Since then, prisoners had been taken from Polunsky to Huntsville on the afternoon of their execution in a white van. Some black students at the university in Huntsville had studied the route that the van took on execution days. It was always the same. It left Polunsky Prison at 1 p.m., turned left onto Route 350, turned left again onto Route 190, and an hour later arrived at Huntsville Prison. The prisoner was surrounded by guards in the van, and other guards followed in a second van. The student's plan was simple and smart, and a small army of helpers was ready to put it into action. At 12:50 p.m., the students had a phone call from a black guard at the prison. He said that Dante was getting into the van. 10 minutes later, 2 white vans left Polunsky Prison. For the first 2 miles on Route 350, there was little traffic. But then, suddenly, the traffic increased, became heavy, and stopped completely. Ahead of the vans, cars were parked in the middle of the road. Each car seemed to have a problem with its engine, and the drivers were trying to fix them. The white vans couldn't move. Behind the vans, another car stopped. The young driver got out, looking upset about her car. She too started examining her engine. More vehicles arrived on all sides of the vans, and soon Route 350 was completely blocked. Students were standing outside their cars, laughing and talking on their cell phones. Some of the male students were pulling out wires in the engines so the cars couldn't start again. The police arrived quickly, but the students were prepared. Each one said that their car wasn't working. The police knew that this wasn't a crime, so they didn't have the right to take the keys from the drivers. More students arrived. There were also a lot of ordinary people trying to use the road. Their cars, too, were now blocking Route 350. The situation was getting out of control, and the white vans were going nowhere. The police officer in charge walked calmly toward the white vans. He smiled politely at the students and asked if they were having a nice day. Guards got out of the vans with their guns ready. Students pushed their way closer to the vans. The officer held out his hand to the student, who seemed to be their leader.
I'm Inman. Can I ask your name?
Quincy Mooney? Unwillingly, he shook the police officer's hand.
Mr. Mooney, I'm sorry about your car problems.
He looked around at the other students.
Are all these people friends of yours?
I've never seen them before. Officer Inman smiled.
Listen, Mr. Mooney, we need to get these cars off the road.
We'll need a lot of mechanics.
No, we're just going to pull them off the road with trucks, Quincy. Or, of course, you could drive the cars away. That'll be a lot cheaper. If we take them away, it'll cost you $100 a car.
It isn't against the law if your car stops working.
No, it isn't. But you and I both know why you're here. The judge will know, too. Now, come with me.
Quincy followed him to the first van. Inman looked inside, and Quincy did the same. The van was empty. They walked to the second van. It, too, was empty. The guards were laughing.
Where's Dante Drum?
Quincy asked, shocked. Inman looked up to the sky. A few seconds later, a plane appeared. Inman pointed up at it and said,
Dante's in there. The police aren't stupid, Quincy. There was too much talk on the internet. You guys have 15 minutes to get off this road. After that, you'll have to pay. Understand?
Quincy walked away, beaten. After a sandwich and 3 cups of coffee, Boyette was feeling better. He said nothing more about the reward money and was ready to talk. He was Dante's last hope. The Court of Appeals had decided that the gamble recording had no legal value. Boyette sat in front of a video camera, which was operated by Robbie's assistant, Carlos. There was also an official court reporter to type Boyette's words as he said them. The court reporter asked Boyette to hold up his right hand and promise to tell the truth. Then Robbie began the questions. Name, place of birth, address, employment, criminal record. He asked if Boyette was giving this statement for a reward. No, said Boyette, there was no reward. Then the questions turned to the events of December 1998. Where was he living at that time? Why? For how long? Did he ever meet Nicole Yarber? Boyette seemed nervous at first, but soon relaxed into his story. He talked about going to the football games, following Nicole, pulling her into his car at the mall. Then the first rape, out in the countryside. After that, he almost left her by the side of the road, hurt but alive. But he wanted to rape her again. They left Sloan. The cell phone in her bag kept ringing, so he stopped at a bridge. He took out her cash, bank card, and driver's license, then threw the bag into the Red River. Before sunrise, he found a cheap hotel. No one saw as he got her inside the room with a gun to her head. They spent the next day there. He told her that he would let her go afterward if she didn't fight him. But after dark, he drove her to the woods outside Joplin, Missouri, and killed her with a belt around her neck. He put her body in a large metal box and dug a hole for it where no one would ever find it. Then he drove back to Sloan and got drunk. Boyette was silent. No one seemed to breathe. Finally, Robbie asked,
When did you hear that Dante Drum had been arrested for Nicole's murder?
I don't know exactly. I saw it on television.
What did you think when he was arrested?
Boyette shook his head and said, I thought, what a bunch of fools. That kid didn't murder her. They have the wrong guy. It was a perfect place to end. Robbie told Carlos to switch off the camera. After listening to some angry speeches outside the courthouse, the protesters in Sloan followed Trey Glover's car along Main Street. They sang and waved signs. In the downtown stores and cafes, owners and customers watched the protest in disbelief. Why were all the blacks so upset? The boy had confessed. He took Nicole's life. So now he was losing his own. That was fair. The protesters walked through the white part of town. Homeowners looked out their windows, then went straight to their gun cupboards. At Civitan Park, Trey Glover decided that they had walked far enough. There were about 1,200 people at the protest now, most of them young. The older protesters had already gone home. But cell phone messages to friends soon brought cars full of angry blacks, and the crowd grew and grew. Everyone could smell the smoke from the fire across town, which had destroyed part of the Drums church. All the other churches in Sloane were now guarded by ministers and churchgoers, all with guns. But it was impossible to protect all the buildings in the city. There was soon a report that an old factory was on fire. At 3 p.m., Boyette signed the statement that the lawyers had prepared. Then the legal document and the video were sent electronically to Cicely Avis at the Defender Group in Austin. At 3:35, she gave 12 copies to the Court of Appeals. As she drove back to her office, she passed the state government building. There was an enormous crowd of protesters outside. Almost everyone was black, and they were shouting, "Free Dante Drum!" Inside the same building, an assistant at Governor Gil Newton's office was watching a 14-minute video of Travis Boyette that had just been sent to her computer. It was hard not to believe Boyette's story, but she was still doubtful. Boyette was a known criminal, and criminals usually told lies. And it was odd that he suddenly wanted to confess to the crime after all these years. She went to find Wayne Walcott, the governor's lawyer and close friend, and described the video to him.
"Who's seen this video?" he asked her.
"Only me."
"And you believe this guy's confession?"
"I didn't say that, but there are lots of details. He's raped other women, and he was in Sloane when the girl disappeared. Why don't you watch it and decide for yourself?"
"I didn't ask for any suggestions, did I?"
Walcott said angrily.
"The guy's clearly lying. I'm not going to watch the video, and I'm not going to show it to the governor."
"We don't have time. The video must stay on your computer. Do you understand?" She didn't understand, but she said yes and left the room. As soon as she had gone, Walcott rushed to the office of Barry Ringfield, the governor's other close advisor. After a few minutes' discussion, they agreed that the governor shouldn't see the video. He was popular with voters because he had never stopped an execution. Even if he believed Boyette's story, he couldn't save Dante. It would be bad politics. Boyette was probably lying, so the video didn't matter. If he was telling the truth, then there were going to be problems. They could only protect Gil Newton if one of them, or maybe the assistant, took the blame for not showing him the video. It was 3:30 p.m. Time for Robbie Flack to go to Huntsville prison. He was going to say a last goodbye to Dante, and then at 6 p.m. to witness his execution, unless there was some good news between now and then. He gave his team instructions for the important hours ahead, then turned to Keith.
"Can you come with me to Huntsville? Dante might need you. Most of the people on his jury were Christians, so he blames the church for the result of his trial. It'll be good for him to talk to a white Christian who's on his side."
Keith wanted a nice bed in a clean hotel and 12 hours of sleep. But as a man of God, he couldn't say no. "Sure," he said to Robbie. Fred Pryor suddenly jumped from his chair. He held out his cell phone and said loudly, "Oh my God! It's a message from Joey Gamble. He wants to sign a statement that he lied at Dante's trial." Fred rang Joey's number. The phone rang and rang. Then a quiet, "Hello? Joey, Fred Pryor here. I've just got your message. What's happening?" "I want to help, Mr. Pryor. I'm really upset by all this." "You're upset? What about Dante? He's got 2.5 hours to live." "I'm so confused," Joey said. Robbie took the phone from Fred. "Joey, it's Robbie Flack here. Are you willing to sign a statement that you lied at Dante's trial?" "Yes." "Then call a taxi. You have to go as quickly as possible to a lawyer's office in Houston. The address is 118 Clay Street. The lawyer's name is Agnes Tanner. Do you understand?" "Yes," said Joey. "We'll send the paperwork to the lawyer, and you can sign it there. Every minute matters, Joey. You have to hurry." When the call ended, Robbie shouted a lot of quick instructions to his team, then drove to the airport with Keith. In the car, he called Agnes Tanner in Houston and told her about the arrangements with Joey. Then they got onto a small plane that belonged to a friend. As the plane flew above Sloan, they could see the black smoke from the factory below them. Keith thought about the events of the past few days. It was hard to believe that he was really here, flying to see the execution of someone that he'd never heard of a week ago. He hoped and prayed that God had a better plan than he did himself. A few minutes later, his chin hit his chest, and he slept for the first time in days. Wayne Walcott and Barry Ringfield were in their daily meeting with Governor Gil Newton. Outside, the enormous crowd was shouting that the governor should stop the execution. "What's happening in Sloan?" asked Newton. Walcott answered, "They've burned 2 churches, one white and one black, and an old factory. The high school closed after fights started in the classrooms. The blacks are protesting in the streets and looking for trouble." "Gil, what about the execution?" asked Ringfield. "Maybe we should wait 30 days until everything's quieter." "No," said the governor. "We can't stop an execution just because the blacks are upset. You know me better than that, Barry. Don't suggest it again." They listened to the angry speech at the protest outside for a minute. Then Newton said, "I want to see it again." It was a video of Dante's confession. They had watched it together several times. Each time, all doubts about the execution disappeared. Ringfield played the video. Drum was facing the camera, looking tired and frightened. "I was crazy about her," he was saying. "That Friday night, I went to find her.
I saw her car at the east side of the mall. Excuse me,
said a voice. Detective Kerber.
You said earlier that her car was parked on the west side of the mall.
That's right, the west side. So I waited and waited. At about 10 o'clock.
Excuse me, Dante, but you said earlier that it was closer to 11.
That's right, 11. And Tori Pickett and I were driving around looking for her car.
Excuse me, Dante, but you said earlier that you were alone. You'd left Tori at his mother's house.
That's right. Sorry about that. So I was alone in my car, and I waited for Nicole and...
The video continued in this way. Dante told his story with regular corrections and help from Kerber. When it was finished, the governor stood up and said,
"Boys, that's all I need.
Let's go outside." They took the stairs down to street level. Then, with guards on all sides, they walked outside to the front of the crowd.
"Hello,"
said Newton into the microphone.
"I'm Gil Newton, Governor of Texas."
The crowd shouted angrily at him.
"Thank you for coming here today,"
he continued.
"It's wonderful that in this great country of ours, we are all able to give voice to our political opinions. You've come here because you believe that Dante Drum is innocent. Well, I'm here to tell you that he's not. He confessed to the crime. He had a good lawyer, a fair trial, and several appeals. All the judges on the case agreed. He murdered Nicole Yarber. Dante Drum is guilty, and he will die at 6 p.m. tonight."
As the crowd shouted angrily at the governor, Ringfield and Walcott smiled. Their boss's speech would be on all the television news programs tonight. His voters, who were almost all white, would love it. For his last meal, Dante didn't want any of the delicious dishes that his mother had cooked for him as a child. Instead, he ordered a pizza. It was a long wait in the cell in Huntsville. He slept a little as he waited and waited for his pizza and his lawyer, and a miracle. The pizza finally arrived at 4 p.m. After years of terrible prison food, it tasted better than he'd expected. As he ate the last piece, Ben Jeter, the head of Huntsville Prison, came in and said, "Your lawyer's almost here." When the plane landed, Robbie and Keith were driven the last few miles to the prison. On the way, Robbie got a call from the office. It was bad news. Milton Prudlow, the head of the Court of Appeals, had discussed Boyette's statement with the other 8 judges that he worked with. They all agreed that Boyette was lying to get attention. The appeal was refused. Robbie had tried to tell himself all afternoon that the appeal was unlikely to succeed, but the news was still a terrible shock. "Did they give a reason?" asked Keith.
"No, they don't have to. If Boyette's telling the truth, It upsets the system. We really want to trust Boyette. The judges really want to distrust him.
At 4:40 p.m., Joey Gamble arrived at the office of Agnes Tanner. Agnes was an old friend of Robbie's and understood how urgent the situation was. She was already holding the statement that Joey had to sign. She took Gamble to a small meeting room and put the statement in front of him.
You can read it, or I can tell you what it says.
Just tell me, said Gamble.
It gives your name and address. It says that you're correcting the evidence that you gave at Dante Drum's trial. It says that, in fact, you didn't see a green van in the parking lot on the night of Nicole's disappearance.
Joey covered his face with his hands. He was crying.
It also says that you called Detective Drew Kerber and named Dante as the killer. There are a lot of details, but we don't have time for everything. I think you understand this, don't you, Joey?
He uncovered his face and said,
I've lived with this for a long time.
Then fix it, Joey.
Agnes held out a pen.
Page 5, bottom right. Quickly.
He signed the statement. It was immediately copied onto a computer and sent electronically to the Defender Group in Austin. Agnes waited to hear that it had arrived safely. But it hadn't. As she shouted at her assistant to send it again, Joey left the office unnoticed. He didn't understand why no one had said thank you. Robbie showed his driver's license to the guards at Huntsville Prison. They were expecting him.
This is Dante's religious advisor, Keith Schrader,
Robbie told them. Keith also showed them his driving license, and the two men followed Ben Jeter to Dante's cell.
We're still planning to go at 6,
said Jeter. Keith was shocked. Go at 6? It was like catching a flight or waiting for a football game to start. The door to the small cell was opened noisily. Robbie and Dante rushed to put their arms around each other. The first real human contact that Dante had had in 9 years. Both men were crying when they separated. Jeter looked at his watch.
It's 4:45, Mr. Flack. You have 60 minutes.
Robbie and Dante were left on their own, and the door was locked. Keith waited outside and phoned Dana. Robbie couldn't decide if he should tell Dante about Boyette. Maybe Dante would like to think that one day, after his death, everyone would know the truth. But the truth was very uncertain, and Dante seemed at peace. He decided not to upset him now with a new, wild story. They sat next to each other, their heads almost touching, and spoke in whispers.
I'm sorry I couldn't stop this, Dante. I'm truly sorry. You did the best that you could, Robbie. And you're still fighting, aren't you?
Robbie told him about the latest news from Joey Gamble.
There's still a chance, Dante. But it's a small one.
Don't feel bad, Robbie. I'll be okay.
Travis Boyette was sitting by a window in Robbie Flack's office, with his stick across his knees. Around him, everyone was shouting at each other.
"What's happening?"
he asked in confusion.
"We're losing," said Carlos angrily.
"What about my statement?"
"The court isn't interested. They think you're lying."
Boyette thought for a minute.
"I want to talk to the reporters,"
he said. Sammy wrote down a number and gave it to Boyette.
"This is the cell phone number of one of our local TV reporters."
Boyette limped over to a phone. Everyone in the office stopped to listen as he arranged to make a TV confession.
"They'll be here in 10 minutes,"
he said when he put down the phone. Milton Prudlow, the head of the Court of Appeals, was in his car on the way to his sports club. He had arranged to play tennis at 5 p.m. His cell phone rang. It was his assistant on the line. He'd had a call from the defender group, who were preparing another appeal.
"What's the time now?"
Prudlow asked crossly.
4:49.
"I get so tired of these games. We close at 5, and everybody knows it."
"Yes, sir,"
said the assistant.
"Do you know what they're sending us?"
"I think it's the same thing as this morning. A witness has changed his story. They're having trouble with their computers."
"We close at 5. I want the door locked at exactly 5 o'clock, not a minute after. Understand?"
"Yes, sir."
At 4:45, Cicely Avis and 2 other members of the defender group left their offices with 12 copies of Gamble's signed statement. As they drove through the traffic, Cicely called the Court of Appeals.
"We're on our way,"
she said to Prudlow's assistant.
"We have a signed statement from the only important witness at the trial." "I just talked to the boss. We close at 5. "But we'll be a few minutes late." "We close at 5.
At 5:07, they arrived at the Court of Appeals. Cicely ran out of the car and up the steps, but the office doors were locked. Prudlow's assistant was already driving home, and Prudlow himself was playing tennis. Chapter 8. Thursday evening. Dante closed his eyes as the guards put him on the bed and tied down his arms, legs, and chest. Then a medical assistant put a needle in each arm. Paul Coffey owned a little house on the edge of a lake 10 miles south of Sloan. For years, he had used it for fishing weekends. It had also been his secret meeting place with Judge Vivian Grail. When his wife found out about Vivian and threw him out of the family house, it had become his home. Tonight, he had guests. Many had left work early, and by 5, they were having a drink and enjoying the view. Most of Coffey's friends were lawyers of one sort or another, but Drew Kerber was also there. Everyone wanted to talk to Kerber, the detective who had solved the Nicole Yarber case. He was proud of catching Drum and was enjoying the attention at the party. Coffee was also getting lots of attention. At the drum trial, he and his team had fought hard against a strong defense from Robbie Flack. They had fought and fought for the people of Sloan and for Nicole, and they had won. It was the greatest success of Coffee's life. The drum case was the main subject of conversation. People looked anxious when Coffee described the last-minute confession of a crazy man called Boyette. But Coffee promised everyone that they needn't worry. The Court of Appeals had already decided that this new confession was false. They could all look forward to celebrating the execution of the murderer at 6 p.m. tonight. Robbie's visit with Dante had finished, and Keith was shown into the cell. The last visit was always saved for religion. Keith had made prison visits before, but he'd never been locked in a cell. It was a frightening experience. And what could he possibly say to a man whose unfair execution was only a few minutes away? Keith prayed silently. Please, God, give me the right words, and then get me out of this terrible place. Dante didn't stand up when he saw Keith, but he held out his hand. Keith shook it. I'm Keith Schrader. Robbie says you're a good guy, said Dante. Keith tried to reply, but he couldn't think of anything to say. Dante interrupted the silence. Do you believe the state should kill people? No, answered Keith. Would Jesus want people to execute criminals? Of course not. Dante smiled and relaxed a little. Okay, you passed the test. Keith relaxed too. Robbie tells me that you often went to church when you were a child, he said. Yes, answered Dante. I was close to God until God forgot about me. Do you blame God for the past 9 years? Yes, Pastor, I do. I was a good boy, studied hard, stayed out of trouble. Then suddenly, I was put in prison, and everyone said I was guilty of murder. I prayed for a fair trial, and God gave me a jury full of Christians. The judge was a Christian too, a Christian who had a relationship with the district attorney behind her husband's back. But all those good white Christians sent me to my death without a thought. There was no forgiveness in their Christian values. I remember thinking, these people have a different God from me. Tell me, Pastor, how can God allow his people to kill so often? God's people are often wrong, Dante, but God is never wrong. Robbie came in. Keith's time with Dante had almost ended. Do you want to pray with me? Keith asked quickly. Dante shook his head, but listened as Keith prayed. We ask you, God, to give Dante strength in his final minutes here on earth and happiness in the next life. Then Robbie and Keith had to go. The clock on the wall showed 5:34. There was a crowd of reporters outside Robbie Flack's office in Sloan. After the protests and church burnings, everyone in Texas was interested in the Drum case. Now they had heard that another man was confessing to the murder. They wanted his statement to go out live on TV. Travis Boyette stood in front of them all, frightened by the cameras and microphones. He wanted to go back inside. Instead, he took a deep breath and said,
"My name is Travis Boyette, and I killed Nicole Yarber."
The reporters had lots of questions, and Boyette answered each one.
"Only the governor could save Dante Drum from execution now,"
said one of the reporters.
"What would you say to him?" "I'd say, you're going to kill an innocent man. Give me 24 hours, and I'll show you the body of Nicole Yarber."
In a bar in Houston, Joey Gamble was watching the TV news. He listened angrily as Boyette described how he'd murdered Nicole. Then Joey realized that this was good news. He'd signed the lawyer's statement, and now the real killer had been found. Dante was safe. Joey ordered another beer. In the governor's office in Austin, Barry Ringfield and Wayne Walcott were also watching Boyette on TV.
"We should go and get the boss."
Soon, Governor Newton was watching too.
"Who is this guy?"
he asked.
"A rapist. He's spent years in prison."
"It's funny how these people arrive just before an execution,"
said the governor.
"He's probably getting money from Robbie Flack."
All three men gave a nervous laugh. The guests at Paul Coffey's party watched as Boyette produced a ring and showed it to the cameras. They felt a wave of fear. Could there be any truth in this man's story? No one was watching TV at Huntsville Prison, where the families of Nicole Yarber and Dante Drum were waiting in two different witness rooms. Both families had a view of the execution room, but they couldn't see each other. At 5:40 p.m., Robbie Flack heard from his office that the fight was lost. The Gamble statement hadn't been delivered in time, and there were no other appeals waiting for decisions. When Dante heard the news, he closed his eyes and breathed deeply. Until then, there had always been hope. It was a small hope, but it had been there. Now, there was nothing. Then he forced a smile.
"Robbie, do you think they'll ever find the guy that did it?"
he asked. Again, Robbie wanted to tell him about Boyette, but decided that it wouldn't help.
"Maybe,"
he said.
"Why?"
"If they find him, promise me something. Make the court say that I was innocent. It doesn't matter how long it takes. Will you do that for me, Robbie?"
"I'll do that, Dante. I'll keep fighting. I promise."
"I can picture it now, Robbie. One day, my family will stand by my grave and celebrate because everyone will know I'm an innocent man. That'll be great, won't it?"
I'll be there too, Dante. We'll have a big party.
Then it was time for Robbie to go.
Look after my mom. Okay, Robbie?
You know I will. They stood with their arms around each other. Then Ben Jeter moved Robbie toward the door. Outside, Robbie sat next to Keith and started crying. Dante walked past them to the execution room, surrounded by guards.
Let's go,
Robbie said to Keith.
It's time to witness an execution.
It's okay, Robbie. I'll just wait here.
Keith had no wish to see this.
Do it for Dante. Or do it for me. You're from Kansas, and they have the death penalty there too, Keith. Come and watch the legal system in action.
Governor Gil Newton was usually very good at making decisions, but now he was having problems. For 10 minutes, he listened to the arguments of Walcott and Ringfield. Walcott wanted him to delay the execution for 30 days so that the police could check Boyette's story. Boyette was probably lying, and the execution could happen in a month's time. Ringfield disagreed. 3 hours before, the governor had told protesters that the execution would definitely go ahead. A delay now would be a sign of weakness.
It's better to be careful,
said Walcott.
Wait 30 days.
It's been 9 years already, said Ringfield. That's long enough.
Finally, Newton stopped them.
Okay, boys. Go and get the reporters,
he said. In the execution room, Dante closed his eyes as the guards put him on the bed and tied down his arms, legs, and chest. Then a medical assistant put a needle in each arm. The needles connected to long tubes that went out through an opening in the wall. At 5:59, the governor stepped in front of the cameras.
Dante Drum confessed to this terrible murder and received a fair trial. It is impossible to believe the story of a new witness produced by Drum's lawyers only a few hours before the execution. The legal system of Texas cannot take any notice of a crazy criminal looking for attention. Drum's execution will continue.
In the witness rooms, a curtain hid the execution room until the tubes were in Dante's arms. Then, suddenly, the curtain was pulled back. Seeing him on the bed like that, Dante's family squeezed tightly together, holding on to each other for support. Robbie held on to them too, thinking about the mistakes that he had made at the trial. No one else blamed him, but he would always blame himself. Dante opened his eyes quickly and looked at his mother. He smiled, made a thumbs-up sign, then closed his eyes again. Ben Jeter phoned the governor's office in Austin. He was told that there was no reason to stop the execution. He stepped to the bed and said, "Mr. Drum, would you like to make a final statement?"
"Yes,"
replied Dante. Jeter positioned a microphone near Dante's face. Dante spoke slowly and clearly.
"I love my mother, my brothers, and my sister, And my father, too, who died before I could say goodbye. I'm sorry I've given you all this trouble, but it wasn't my fault. Robbie, I love you, man. You're the greatest. To the family of Nicole Yarber, I'm sorry about what happened to her. She was a nice girl, and I hope one day you'll find the man who killed her.
He stopped, breathed hard, then shouted,
I am an innocent man. For 9 years, the state of Texas has kept me in prison for a crime that I didn't commit. To Detective Drew Kerber, Paul Coffey, Judge Grail, all those people on the jury, the fools at the Court of Appeals, and to Governor Newton, your day of judgment is coming. They will find the real killer, and the memory of Dante Drum will destroy you.
He turned and looked at his mother.
Goodbye, Mom. I love you.
After a few seconds of silence, Ben Jeter moved the microphone away. He stepped back and gave a sign. The first poison was sent through the tube into Dante's arm. Dante closed his eyes for the last time and went into a heavy sleep. 2 minutes later, a second poison stopped his breathing. Then there was a third poison to stop his heart. At 6:19, the medical assistant checked Dante's body, then whispered a quick word to Ben Jeter. At 6:21, Jeter told the people in the witness rooms that Dante Drum was dead. Chapter 9. Thursday night. A rock hit a police officer in the mouth, and he fell to the ground. The crowd went wild. More rocks were thrown at the line of police officers. At Robbie Flack's office, the news of Dante's death was received without a word. Only 3 hours earlier, they had been full of hope, working on the Boyette and Gamble statements. It was hard to believe that their miracle had disappeared as quickly as it had arrived. Travis Boyette sat in a corner, rubbing his head.
I don't understand. What happened? Those people didn't listen to me.
You were too late, said Carlos angrily. 9 years too late.
We just needed 24 hours, Boyette, continued Sammy. Why didn't you come here yesterday? So we had time to find the body. With a body, it would be clear that they had the wrong guy. You waited too long. Dante is dead because of you.
TV presenter Sean Fortis had just flown into Huntsville from another execution in Florida. He was excited about his final interview with Riva. The Drum case was one of the best he'd ever covered. And best of all, Riva hadn't yet heard about the appearance of Travis Boyette. She'd been in the prison when he was on TV. When the cameras were ready, Fortis looked at Riva and said,
Riva, it's done. Tell us what you saw.
With tears in her eyes, Riva said,
I saw him for the first time in 8 years. I saw the man who killed my baby.
Tell us about the execution.
the dying.
It was much too easy. He just went to sleep.
And you were comparing that to Nicole's terrible death?
Yes, my poor baby. She suffered so much and...
Her voice disappeared in the emotion. And did Drum say that he was innocent?
Oh, yes. He said the same old stuff that we've been hearing for years. I expect all murderers say they're innocent.
Have you ever thought that maybe someone else murdered Nicole? That maybe Drum really was innocent?
No, not for a minute. Dante confessed.
Fortis moved away from Riva slightly. Have you heard of a man named Travis Boyette? Riva looked confused.
Who?
Travis Boyette. At 5:30 this afternoon, he went on television in Sloan and said that he was the killer.
Of course he wasn't the killer,
said Riva. Fortis pointed at a TV in the corner, and a video of Boyette's TV appearance came on. Riva watched, shaking her head. She knew that he was lying. But when Boyette pulled out Nicole's ring and put it close to the camera, her face went pale. When the video stopped, Fortis shouted, "Did you see the ring, Riva?" She looked frightened, upset. Then she remembered that she was on camera.
Yes,
she managed to say. And is it Nicole's?
Oh, it's impossible to say. Who is that guy?
A criminal who's spent a long time in prison. He's raped several women.
A criminal? Well, who can believe him?
So you don't believe him, Riva?
Of course not.
But Riva's tears were gone, and her confidence was gone too. She looked very tired. As Fortis started to ask another question, she said,
Sean, it's been a long day. I'm going home.
She pulled the microphone off her jacket and left the room. At Paul Coffey's party by the lake, the news of Drum's execution had been greeted with smiles and congratulations. But now it was 8 o'clock, and the food was finished. According to the news, at least 4 cars had been burned in Sloan in the last couple of hours. Everyone was anxious to get home. Drew Kerber stood next to Coffey as he said goodbye to his guests. Then he opened a beer and said, "We need to talk." Coffey took a beer too. Then they walked to the edge of the lake. What happens if this Boyette guy is telling the truth, Paul? You can't be serious. Of course he's not telling the truth. Maybe not. But let's imagine it for a minute. This Boyette guy finds them the body. What then? Help me here. You're the lawyer. I don't believe this, Drew. Could we go to prison? For what? How about murder? The murder of Dante Drum, do you mean? Are you drunk? Yes, a bit drunk. But tell me, what happens if Boyette's story is true? Coffey thought for a minute. Nothing happens. No one has ever been arrested for a wrong decision in the courts. The jury decided the case, not us.
Could I lose my job? Maybe, but I doubt it. The police would probably stop giving you work, but they'd keep paying you.
There was another pause. Then Coffee said,
Just relax. You did a good job on the drum case. He got a fair trial. And Drew, the boy, confessed.
Of course he did.
Without that confession, though, would he still be alive? You're not worried about the confession now, are you?
No. I followed all the rules.
Forget it, Drew.
We can't do anything about it now.
The drum boy's coming home in a coffin.
At Civitan Park, protesters had heard that Dante was dead. They were in an ugly mood. A rock hit a police officer in the mouth, and he fell to the ground. The crowd went wild. More rocks were thrown at the line of police officers. The police told the crowd to go home. If they didn't, there would be arrests. Trey Glover, who had led the protest earlier in the day, walked forward with 3 other students. They were offering themselves for arrest. As an officer pushed Trey into a car, a rock landed on his head. The officer forgot about Trey and started chasing the kid who had thrown the rock. Other police officers joined him in the chase. A minute later, a police car was on fire. A TV van arrived, and a fair-haired reporter got out with her microphone. A police officer told her to get back in the van urgently. But before she could follow his instructions, a brick hit her head. There was blood everywhere. When the crowd started throwing smoke bombs, the police officer in charge spoke on the phone with Harris Rooney, the mayor of Sloan. The decision was made to use tear gas. There were screams when the first tear gas was fired into the crowd. The protesters were scared and angry. They emptied the park as quickly as possible, throwing rocks as they ran. By 9, Civitan Park was under police control. The protesters had left behind them broken seats and empty vehicles, and a gray cloud from the smoke bombs hung in the air. At the police station, 12 protesters were under arrest. Others were in the hospital because of the tear gas. 3 police officers and the reporter were also in the hospital. The black protesters ran away from Civitan Park and into the streets. They had all grown up with stories of the 1960s, when tear gas had been used at famous protests for black civil rights. Now, history was repeating itself. The use of tear gas made them even angrier than before. They were going to continue fighting. The white men outside their homes held their guns tightly. When one man saw some black faces in his street, he fired into the air. The noise of the shot traveled right across town. It was a sign. The whites were ready to fight back. Through the city, groups of blacks were breaking windows and throwing rocks at car drivers. Harris Rooney, the mayor, realized that the police were losing control of the city. What could he do to stop this craziness? He phoned Johnny Canty, the minister at the Drums Church. Canty had spoken at the protest yesterday, before the violence had started.
Pastor, we need your help. The protesters are out of control. Someone's going to die soon." "Someone has already died," Canty reminded him. "I'm waiting with the Drum family for Dante's body." "I'm sorry, but more deaths won't bring Dante back. Maybe you can talk to the protesters. They'll listen to you." "I have one question for you first. Did your police use tear gas on those kids in Civitan Park?" "Yes, they did. They had no choice." "There is always a choice, Mr. Rooney. When they gassed our children, the police made a bad situation worse. I'm not going to fix the damage now."
Canty put down the phone.
"Dante is ready now," said the man at the funeral home. Roberta left her children with Johnny Canty and went into the room alone. Her beautiful boy was lying on a narrow table. He was dressed in the clothes that the prison had given him for his execution: a thin white shirt, old pants, and cheap shoes. She kissed his face, the lips, the nose, the chin, as her tears fell on him like rain. She hadn't touched him in 8 years. His skin wasn't cold, but it wasn't warm either. He looked so peaceful. Dead, but not damaged, not diseased. There was no sign of the place where the needles had gone into his arms. She could almost believe that he was resting, waiting for the next drug that would wake him and allow him to go home with his mother. From her bag, she took out some scissors. She carefully cut off the prison clothes, singing Christian songs as the tears ran down her face. When all the clothes were gone, she washed and dried Dante's body. Then she started dressing him in the smart new clothes that she had brought. It wasn't easy. His arms didn't bend now, but she managed to put the fine white shirt on, one arm at a time. Then the dark gray jacket and pants of his new suit. Then the socks, which were more difficult than she had expected, and the shoes that Dante had worn to church as a teenager. Finally, she pulled a gold tie tight around his neck and admired her work. He looked so handsome. She bent over and kissed him again. Tomorrow she had to plan his funeral. She was going to be strong and brave. Now, though, she wanted to be alone with her child, to ache and cry for the son who had been taken from her. Chapter 10. Friday. As the digging continued, Robbie filmed it on the video camera. Each time some earth was removed, more of the box appeared. Before sunrise on Friday, a group of vehicles left Sloan and traveled east. Robbie, Carlos, and Fred were in front, in a small truck. Keith drove his car behind the truck, with Boyette in the passenger seat. Behind Keith was a van with a reporter and a cameraman from Sloan's TV station. Robbie didn't trust any reporters, but he needed someone to record the day's events. The people of Sloan had had little sleep the night before. No one had been killed in the violence,
which was a miracle, but 24 people had been taken to the hospital. There had been 40 arrests, and more fires in cars and empty buildings than the fire department could count.
If we find the body, last night will seem like a children's party,
said Robbie. The vehicle stopped for a coffee break after 5 hours, not far from Joplin, Missouri. When they continued, Keith and Boyette were in front. Keith could see that Boyette was getting nervous. His fingers drummed on his stick.
"Turn right, after the gas station,"
he said. They left the main road and drove through hilly country.
"This looks right,"
he said as he rubbed his head. Please, Keith thought, not another seizure. Please, not now, Travis.
"Look for a little river with a wooden bridge,"
said Boyette. Then again,
"Yes, this looks right."
After the bridge, he said,
"Drive slower. There's a dirt road on the left here somewhere. Yes, look. This is it."
He pointed at a narrow, dark road shaded by trees. Keith turned, and the other vehicles followed.
"This road follows the river. There's a camping area down here on the right. Or there was."
They drove for more than a mile. There was no traffic, no sign of human life. They came to the camping area, but the grass was knee-high. There hadn't been any tents there for years.
"I think we should stop,"
said Boyette.
"Only a truck can go farther. We'll have to leave the car and the van here."
They all parked and got out.
How far is it from here?
Asked Robbie.
"Half a mile up the hill."
And what will we find when we get there?
Boyette held his stick and stared at the ground.
"The grave is up there, Mr. Flack. That's where you'll find Nicole."
They decided that Carlos and the guys from the TV station should wait with the car and the van. The others could squeeze into the truck. Boyette sat in the passenger seat as they drove through the trees. He rubbed his head, trying hard to find something familiar.
"This might be the place,"
he said finally. They got out with metal detectors and searched the area. Boyette limped around, hitting plants with his stick.
"Look for an old car wheel,"
he said more than once. But there was no wheel, and no noise from the metal detectors. They climbed back into the truck and continued slowly up the hill. When the path separated into two, they stopped again. Boyette studied the two routes carefully.
"Over there,"
he said finally, pointing to the right. They continued on foot as the woods became thicker. They walked all around the area, looking for the wheel. A metal detector made a noise, and excitement spread through the group. But it was just a beer can.
"It all looks different now,"
said Boyette.
"The trees have grown a lot in 9 years."
None of them thought they were going to find anything, but they continued searching, hoping for a miracle. After half an hour, Boyette said,
"This isn't it. Let's move on."
Back in the truck, Robbie and Keith looked at each other, thinking, why did we ever trust this guy? The road turned, and Boyette pointed again.
"This is it,"
he said, and jumped out of the truck before the engine was turned off. Keith followed him, but his foot hit something hard, and he fell. As he stood and brushed dead leaves from his clothes, he saw the thing at his feet. It was a car wheel, almost hidden by the plants. Boyette saw the wheel too, and said,
"Get the metal detectors."
Seconds later, the metal detectors were making loud noises. It was time to start digging. They worked hard for 10 minutes, and then they heard the sound that they were hoping for. Their tools had hit something metal.
"Let's stop for a second,"
said Robbie. He looked at Boyette.
"Tell us exactly what we're going to find."
"Well, it's a metal box, a very heavy one. I really hurt my back pulling it over here. It's orange, with the name of the company painted on the front. R.S. McGuire and Sons, Fort Smith, Arkansas. It opens from the top."
"And inside?"
"Her clothes are next to her head, and her driver's license and bank card are in one of the pockets. There's a belt around her neck, black, 2 inches wide."
As the digging continued, Robbie filmed it on the video camera. Each time some earth was removed, more of the box appeared. It became clear that it was orange. Then they could see the words, R.S. McGuire and Sons.
"That's enough for now,"
said Robbie.
"We don't want to get it out of the ground yet."
There was a lock to keep the box closed, a cheap lock that opened if you knew the correct 4 numbers.
"What are the numbers, Travis?"
asked Robbie. Boyette smiled. He gently took the lock in his hands and shook away the dirt. Then he started turning the numbers. 17, 50, 4, 55. He pulled sharply, and the lock opened. Keith felt excited, although he knew what terrible things the box contained. Robbie gave everyone a pair of plastic gloves. Then slowly, the box was opened. Inside, there was no body, just bones and some long, fair hair. Above the shoulder bones, there was some black leather, the belt. In the corner of the box was a pile of clothes. Keith closed his eyes and asked God to forgive Boyette. Robbie closed his eyes and thought how much he hated the world. Boyette stepped back from the box and started rubbing his head. Carefully they took out the clothes. They had holes in them, probably made by insects. Among them, they found a bank card and a driver's license with a photo of Nicole on it. They took photographs, but touched nothing else. Then they went back down the hill to the camping area, where Robbie described the grave to the others. The reporter wanted to go and film it before the police arrived. He argued with Robbie, who wanted to wait for the police. Suddenly, behind them, there was a cry of pain. They turned and saw Boyette lying on the ground, shaking violently. Everyone stood over him, not knowing what to do. After a minute or two, the shaking stopped. Boyette held his head and cried softly. Then he lay back and stopped moving.
"Hey, Travis, can you hear me?"
asked Keith, touching his shoulder. No answer.
"Is he dead?"
asked Robbie.
"No. He usually wakes up after a few minutes when he has these seizures,"
said Keith, hoping that he sounded more confident than he felt.
"Why don't we end all his suffering?"
suggested Robbie.
"Just one hit on the head. There's even a grave up there that's going to be empty soon."
"Be quiet, Robbie," said Keith, but everyone else seemed to like the idea. Boyette was soon forgotten, as people called the Joplin police station and made arrangements. Keith stayed next to Boyette. After 5 minutes, he said,
"Robbie, I think this might be serious. He still hasn't moved."
"I'm not a doctor, Keith. What do you want me to do?"
"Maybe we should take him to a hospital."
"I'm sorry, Keith, but there's a lot happening right now. Boyette's health isn't my biggest worry, and he'll be dead from that brain tumor sooner or later, won't he?"
Robbie and the others didn't care, but Keith couldn't leave a man to die without trying to help him. He pulled Boyette into his car and got into the driver's seat. Robbie came over.
"Call me when you get to a hospital, and don't let Boyette out of your sight. I'm sure the police will want to talk to him."
"I'm not planning to stay at the hospital with him, Robbie. I have to go home to Kansas."
"You have our cell numbers. Call us, okay?"
The two men shook hands, not sure if they would see each other again. It was strange. They had only met the day before, but after everything that had happened, they felt that they had known each other for years.
"Thanks for everything, Keith,"
said Robbie.
"It wasn't enough."
"No, but it was brave to try. You did all that you could."
Keith drove without a map, stopping several times to ask for directions. Finally, he found a hospital. Boyette, who still hadn't moved, was taken inside. As the doctors checked Boyette, Keith called Robbie to tell him where he was.
"The police are here,"
said Robbie.
"They'll send some officers to the hospital."
A few minutes later, 2 officers arrived. Keith ate some sandwiches with them and explained his connection to Boyette. Then, finally, Keith was a free man. He got into his car and started driving. It was a great feeling to look at the empty passenger seat. With luck, he would never have to see Boyette again. At the hospital, a doctor told the police officers that Boyette was too weak to answer any questions. The officers waited outside his hospital room, reading magazines. The other side of the door, there were 6 beds, each separated by a thin curtain. The nurses came and went. All the patients were dangerously ill. Finally, a doctor went in to check on Boyette. When he pulled the curtain by bed 4, he froze in disbelief. The tubes were hanging from the medical machines. The empty bed had a walking stick on top of it. Boyette was gone. Chapter 11. Saturday.
He did nothing wrong, and he was killed by the state of Texas. I have given you the names of the people who are responsible.
Dante Drum had become the biggest news story in the country. On Saturday morning, Robbie Flack held a meeting with reporters from every corner of the United States. It was a defense lawyer's dream. After years of talking to people who didn't want to listen, he now had everyone's attention.
Good morning, and thank you for coming,
he said into the microphone.
Bones were found yesterday in the hills south of Joplin, Missouri. I was there with members of my team and with a man named Travis Boyette. Boyette led us to the place where he dug a grave for Nicole almost 9 years ago. According to police scientists, there is no doubt that the bones are Nicole's.
Robbie described the grave in detail and showed photos of the bank card and driver's license that were found in it. Then he talked about Boyette and said that he had disappeared. He explained that, officially, he was not wanted by the police, as they had already decided that Dante was guilty of Nicole's murder. Everyone in the room listened in silence. Robbie's speech was going out live on TV across the country. Reva was watching from her living room. During last night's troubles, her husband's store had been burned, so she hadn't had much sleep. Now she was finding it hard to understand what Robbie was saying. Nicole and her driver's license were not in the Red River? And Dante Drum was not the killer? How was that possible? Had she spent the last 9 years hating the wrong person? Had she watched the wrong man die? Next, Robbie showed a photo of Detective Drew Kerber.
This is the man who caused the death of Dante Drum. I plan to take him to court, and I hope that from today he never works as a police officer again.
Robbie explained the methods that Kerber used to get Dante's confession. In a locked room at the police station, Kerber watched Robbie's performance on TV. I'm finished, he thought. Next, Robbie attacked Paul Coffey and Judge Vivian Grail.
A judge's job is to make sure that a trial is fair. But Judge Vivian Grail was sleeping with the district attorney, who was trying to prove that Dante was guilty. Because of this, she allowed a black man to get an all-white jury.
Coffey was watching at his house on the lake. He tried to think of a new story to fit the facts. Maybe he could tell everyone that Drum and Boyette were working together. Robbie now spoke about Joey Gamble.
Joey lied again and again, and his lies sent Dante to his execution,
he told the reporters. Joey was at his mother's house in Sloan. He had hoped that people would be proud of him for telling the truth at last. Instead, his mother shouted at him, "You helped to kill that boy!" Then Robbie described the events of Thursday.
At exactly 3:55 p.m., lawyers for Dante Drum sent the Court of Criminal Appeals a video of Travis Boyette's full confession. An hour later, all 9 judges there decided that Boyette was lying. The court closes for business at 5 p.m., even when there is an execution later that day. We had a signed statement from Joey Gamble saying that he had lied in court. Lawyers for Dante called the court before 5 to say that the statement was on its way. But when they tried to deliver the statement at 5:07, the doors were locked. In Austin, Judge Milton Prudlow's wife looked angrily at her husband.
Milton, tell me that isn't true.
Well, my dear, I saw the video, but you can't trust a guy like Boyette to tell the truth.
Today, Milton, it's easier to trust Boyette than the Court of Criminal Appeals.
Robbie paused and had a drink of water. Then he continued.
The governor's office received a copy of the Boyette video at 3:11 p.m. on Thursday. I don't know if the governor saw the video, but later that afternoon he refused to delay the execution.
The governor turned from the TV to ask his friends Ringfield and Walcott if Robbie was right about the video. Walcott lied first.
I have no idea. There was a lot happening that afternoon.
Ringfield told the second lie.
This is the first time that I've heard of it.
The governor tried to think. Would he lose votes over this?
Find out what happened. Now!
He shouted. Robbie was near the end of his speech. He looked through his notes to check that he hadn't forgotten anything. Then he looked up at the reporters.
We have finally done something that civil rights protesters have warned against for many years. We have executed an innocent man. There have been other cases where the facts are unclear. But with Dante, there is no doubt. He did nothing wrong, and he was killed by the state of Texas. I have given you the names of the people who are responsible.
Robbie walked to the edge of the room and took the hand of Roberta Drum. He led her to the microphone.
My name is Roberta Drum,
she started softly.
Dante was my son. My family and I are in shock, and we have little to say to you at this time. But I ask all the people of this town to stop the violence. Stop the rock throwing and the church burning and the insults. Please stop. Yes, we are angry, but we can change nothing this way. The violence only harms the memory of my son.
Robbie took the microphone again.
May Dante rest in peace.
Thank you. The white members of the Sloan High School football team drove to their game against Longview High. The game had been planned for Friday night in Sloan, but the Longview players had been worried that they wouldn't be safe. And they were right to worry. A game with a crowd of 5,000 people, most of them white, was unlikely to escape trouble. If the Sloan team didn't play the game, though, their results for the season would suffer badly. Instead, they decided to play it away from Sloan, in secret and without any supporters, on Saturday afternoon. The Sloan players felt strange, preparing for a game with no band or cheerleaders, and no hope of winning. Most of the strongest members of the team were black, and they had refused to play. Their star player, Trey Glover, was still under arrest at the police station. Longview had the first kick. But as the kicker started running toward the ball, another Longview player stepped forward and picked it up. The Sloan team was shocked. This was against the rules. All the black Longview players then took off their shirts and put them on the ground. They formed a circle in the center of the field. "We aren't playing," they told the game officials. "It's a protest. We're supporting our brothers in Sloan." The game officials didn't know what to do. They stood on the side of the field looking confused. Then, a white Longview player walked over to the black players and sat down. One after another, the rest of the Longview players joined them too. The teacher in charge of the Sloan team couldn't believe his luck. Now, Sloan would win all the points for the game. But then, Denny Weeks, a Sloan player whose father was a police officer, walked to the center of the field. The boy took off his blue Sloan shirt and shook hands with the Longview players.
"I thought Dante was guilty. We all did, because he confessed. We were so wrong."
The other Sloan players joined Denny. No one on either side wanted to play the game. They sat together on the grass in memory of Dante Drum. Before dark, Roberta Drum and her family walked to Civitan Park. They met with the young people who were protesting there. In one-to-one conversations, they talked about Dante's death and the effect that it was having. The loud, angry music was turned off as people listened to Roberta's words.
"We don't want the name of Dante Drum to be remembered for violence and blood. Your rocks and fires won't help anyone. Violence just causes more violence. Please go home and spend some time with your mothers."
To his people, Dante Drum was already a hero. Now the brave actions of his mother made them go home. There would be no violence that night. Chapter 12. Afterward.
"Get in the car,"
he said, pushing her inside. He hit her face hard.
"Don't make a sound, and keep your head down."
It had been likely on Friday and almost certain on Saturday. Now, on Sunday, the newspapers told the world that there was no possible doubt. An innocent man had been executed. The police in Joplin had found scientific evidence that Boyette had raped Nicole. The Drum case was described in detail, and the actions of Kerber, Coffey, Grail, and Prudlow were strongly criticized. Writers in all the country's most important papers agreed. There must be no more executions. Forever, if possible. Or at least until the legal system was made fairer. There was also a lot of information about the hunt for Travis Boyette. His face was shown every 30 minutes on TV. No one had seen him since he had disappeared from the hospital in Joplin 2 days ago. Until now, Keith Schrader had never talked about politics at his Sunday service. But today he was a different person. He suddenly felt that an unfair legal system was the most important subject to discuss in church. He couldn't keep silent about Dante's death.
Most of you already know that an innocent man was executed in Texas on Thursday. You probably don't know that Nicole Yarber's real killer was sitting in this church exactly a week ago.
He enjoyed seeing the change in people's faces.
He came to me on Monday for advice. Then he went to Texas.
Dana had asked him not to include his own part in this trip. He had acted illegally when he drove Boyette out of Kansas, and she didn't want him to have any trouble from the police.
There, he tried to stop the execution. He was unsuccessful.
Keith spoke for an hour about the Christian values of peace and forgiveness. He told the members of his church that it could never be right to kill people, even if those people were themselves killers. The death penalty broke God's laws and was deeply wrong. On Monday, Keith got a phone call from a newspaper reporter called Eliza Keene. She had looked at the Huntsville prison records and seen Keith's name on the list of witnesses at Dante's execution. She had found his address and guessed his connection with Boyette, whose last address was in the same town. She wanted Keith to tell her his story. He wasn't ashamed of what he had done, and he didn't want to lie. He told Ms. Keene everything. The next morning, the phone rang at 6:02 a.m.
"Good morning," said a foreign voice. "I am Antoine Didier from the French newspaper Le Monde. I have read Eliza Keene's story about Keith Schrader and would like to speak to him about the drum case."
Keith told the reporter politely that he had nothing to say and put down the phone. It rang again immediately. Keith went through the house and switched off all 4 phones. He hid himself in St. Francis Hospital all day, visiting sick members of the church. Then, in the evening, he and Dana took their children out for a pizza. It was 9:30 when the boys were finally in bed and asleep, and Keith switched on the phones. "If any reporters ring, I'll switch them off again," he decided. Keith was still awake when the phone rang at 11:12.
"Hello," he said.
"Pastor, how are you?"
It was Travis Boyette. Keith gently kicked Dana, who was asleep beside him.
"Hello, Travis," he said.
Dana suddenly came to life. She quickly went into another room and called the police on her cell phone.
"What are you doing these days?"
Keith asked Boyette. I must keep him talking as long as possible, he thought.
"Are you still in Missouri?"
"No, I left before you did, Pastor. I'm here and there."
"You left your stick on the hospital bed, Travis. Why did you do that?"
"I don't need it. I've never needed it. I told you a few little lies, Pastor. I hope you'll be able to forgive me. I have a brain tumor,
but it's been with me a long time. It isn't doing me any harm, and I don't think it'll ever kill me. The stick? Well, that's always useful in a fight. There are some dangerous people out there. I have to be able to defend myself.
But you had a limp.
If you're using a stick, Pastor, you have to have a limp, don't you?
Keith was too angry to speak.
I'll tell you something, Pastor,
continued Boyette.
I need to find a woman. You know what I mean?
Listen to me, Travis. Tell me where you are. I can come and get you. We can go to the police together. Do the right thing this time, Travis.
But they'll put me in prison, and I don't like prison. I've seen enough prison cells already.
But you're tired of hurting people, Travis. You know you are.
I guess. Sorry, Pastor. I have to go.
Call me again, Travis. Any time. But the line was already dead. Dana came back in. The police had found out that the call was made on a cell phone in Lincoln, Nebraska. The only place big enough for Dante's funeral was the high school gym. His coffin was under a basketball goal, with a large, smiling photo of him behind it. Under the opposite goal, there was an area packed full of reporters. More than 2,000 people crowded into the rest of the room. Most were black, but every member of the Sloan football team, black and white, had come. Dante had never discussed his funeral, so his mother had chosen the music and the speakers. A white minister prayed about love and forgiveness, and there were Christian songs. Roberta had never really believed that Dante had turned away from religion. Then Robbie Flack made a speech. As he walked to the front of the gym, the crowd stood up and shouted their support. For a long time, Robbie just stood at the microphone, accepting the crowd's thanks with tears in his eyes. For the last few days, Robbie had been busy. He was taking everyone to court. The city of Sloan, the governor of Texas, the Court of Criminal Appeals, Paul Coffey, Drew Kerber. He had never understood the Christian idea of love and forgiveness, but he tried to forget about his anger for a few minutes. He shared with the crowd some memories of Dante and read out a funny letter from him about prison food. Then he described his last visit.
Dante asked me to keep working, to prove his innocence. And when the courts realized their mistake, he wanted his family and friends to have a party at his grave. He wanted us to tell the whole world, Dante Drum is an innocent man. Well, Dante, we're planning that party.
Nicole Yarber's funeral the next day was a smaller event. Her friends had already said their goodbyes many times at services in her memory at the Red River. And Riva was very clear that she wanted no reporters. She was also clear that Paul Coffey and Drew Kerber were not invited. She hated them now as much as she once hated Drum. In his half-burned church, the minister told stories of Nicole's life, while in his head, he prayed for God's forgiveness. He, like everyone else in the church, had been a strong supporter of Drum's execution.
At the end of the service, Nicole's coffin was taken to a grave in the churchyard. She had come to her final resting place. At 9:15 p.m. on Thursday night, Lily Reed locked the door of the store where she worked. She left the mall and walked across the parking lot to her car. She was in a hurry. Her boyfriend was waiting for her at a bar half a mile away. As she was opening the door to her car, she heard a footstep behind her. Then a man's voice said, "Hi, Lily." Lily turned to look at the man. She saw a gun and a face that she would never forget. She tried to scream, but, too fast, the man put his hand over her mouth. "Get in the car," he said, pushing her inside. He hit her face hard. "Don't make a sound, and keep your head down." Almost too scared to move, she did as she was told. Enrico Muñez had been in the parking lot for half an hour. His wife was finishing work late, again, and he was sitting in his truck, bored. He saw a girl walking to a car parked opposite his own. Then suddenly, a man appeared with a gun and forced her into the car. When the car started moving, Enrico acted without thinking. He switched on his engine and drove fast. He had to stop the other car from leaving the parking lot. He caught it on a corner and crashed into its front right wheel. Then he took a stick from under his seat and ran at the girl's attacker. He hit the man hard on the head, and the man fell to the ground. Lily started screaming now and ran from the car. Soon the police arrived, and an ambulance. Enrico told them what had happened. The attacker had no wallet, no cards, nothing in his pockets, except $230 in cash. He refused to give his name. At the hospital, the doctors found that Enrico's stick had done his head some serious damage. They also found that the man had a brain tumor. It wasn't long before a police officer made the connection. "I think our mysterious attacker might be that Boyette guy." 2 weeks after Dante's execution, Keith was back in Sloan. This time, Dana had come with him, leaving the kids with her parents. Sloan seemed a completely different place, quiet and peaceful, with none of the black smoke that had hung in the air on Keith's last visit. Work was already in progress to fix the buildings that had been destroyed in the protests. It was a warm day, so Robbie had put out tables beside his pool. Everyone in Robbie's team was at the party, with about 20 members of the Drum family, including some small children. The Drums were all pleased to see Keith. His last-minute drive to save Dante was now famous. He was a hero. Keith sat next to Roberta at the meal. Conversation was difficult at first. The pain of losing Dante was still fresh, but she tried hard to be friendly. Soon, they were talking happily about her grandchildren. Later, Robbie came to talk to him.
"How are things at home? Have the police arrested you yet?"
"No," answered Keith, "but there's going to be a court case. My lawyer thinks I'll have to pay some money to the court, but I won't have to go to prison. The leaders at my church aren't happy, though. It's crazy.
They say that I did the right thing, but they don't like the idea of one of their ministers breaking the law. I'll probably lose my job.
I'm sorry.
Don't be. I've got a better plan. A church in Austin has invited me to speak at their service on Sunday. It's a much more political church than my church in Topeka. The people there are really interested in protesting against executions and fighting social problems. And their minister is old. He's giving up work in a few months' time. I'm hoping they'll offer me the job.
That's great, Keith. Austin is only a few hours' drive away.
And what about you, Robbie?
Well, I'm taking everyone to court, but we won't know the results for a long time. Paul Coffey has gone, so there's a new district attorney. He's planning to apologize officially to the Drum family. Kerber's lost his job, too, but Prudlow at the Court of Criminal Appeals will probably keep his.
What about the governor?
He's found an excuse to visit Iraq until everyone's forgotten about Drum. He thinks the problem will go away, but I'm not so sure. Even the strongest supporters of the death penalty want changes in Texas. Maybe this time we can really make a difference.
The next morning, Keith and Dana were ready to go to Austin. But first, they stopped at the graveyard in Sloan. They found Dante's grave easily, a pile of red earth surrounded by hundreds of flowers. The gravestone said, Dante Lamar Drum, born September 22nd, 1980. Wrongly executed by the state of Texas on November 8th, 2007. Here lies an innocent man. A court in Missouri found Travis Boyette guilty of murdering Nicole Yarber. He was given the death penalty. Like Dante, Boyette was going to have many years in prison before his execution date finally arrived. When Governor Gil Newton returned from Iraq, he was forced to start a political discussion about the future of the death penalty. Many Texas politicians wanted executions to stop until they could look carefully at the causes of mistakes in murder cases. They also wanted the Drum family to receive $20 million for Dante's wrongful killing. The details of the arrangements were discussed again and again, and no one could agree. In the end, the Drum family was paid $1 million.
The government has a duty to be careful with its money,
said the governor when the decision was made public. It was reported that the governor's trip to Iraq had cost the public $400,000. 8 months after the death of Dante Drum, another prisoner, Adam Flores, was taken from Pulaski Prison to Huntsville. There he was met by Ben Jeter and given his last meal. Then, at exactly 6 p.m., he was taken to the execution room and tied to a bed. 20 minutes later, he was dead.